The radiation storm hit Felthera Prime like the wrath of an angry god. Jake stood alone in the plaza as waves of deadly energy washed over the planet, turning the sky into a brilliant canvas of green and gold fire. His radiation detector had given up trying to measure the impossible levels and simply displayed error messages while emitting a continuous high-pitched scream. The electromagnetic pulse struck first, sending currents of electricity through every metallic surface in the city. Jake watched the crystal spires around the plaza flicker and spark as their internal systems overloaded, while floating platforms crashed to the ground with thunderous impacts. The beautiful architecture that defined Catherian civilization began to fail as circuits burned out and power grids collapsed across the planet. Inside the makeshift shelter, Jake could hear muffled voices as the people he had saved tried to stay calm. Lady Zephyria was speaking in her musical language, her voice steady and reassuring as she helped organize the frightened crowd. Danny Walsh was translating for the humans, explaining what was happening in terms that everyone could understand. The cooling units Jake had repurposed were working perfectly, circulating clean air throughout the cramped space, but the shelter itself was beginning to show signs of stress. The metallic fabric walls rippled and sparked as electrical currents flowed through them, and Jake could see stress fractures forming where the shopping cart frames joined together. He pulled a multi-tool from his belt and began making adjustments, tightening connections and reinforcing weak points while radiation levels that should have killed him instantly continued to climb. The human body wasn't designed to survive this kind of exposure, but Jake's military training had included conditioning that helped him function longer than most people in extreme environments. He had also taken radiation treatments during the war that gave him some resistance to cellular damage, though nothing that could protect him indefinitely from a Class 9 solar flare. His hands began to shake as the radiation attacked his nervous system, but he forced himself to keep working. A critical joint where two wall panels met was starting to separate, and if it failed completely, the entire shelter could collapse. Jake wedged himself between the panels and used his body weight to hold them together while he reinforced the connection with spare fabric and crystal fragments. The effort left him gasping and dizzy, but the shelter held. Through the transparent sections of the walls, he could see the faces of the people inside, watching him with expressions of amazement and terror. Lady Zephyria was pressed against the inner surface near where he worked, her large eyes filled with tears as she watched him slowly dying to keep them alive. The storm raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Jake lost track of time as his body began to shut down from radiation poisoning, his vision blurring and his coordination failing. But every time he thought about giving up, he remembered the faces inside the shelter and found the strength to continue. When the worst of the radiation finally passed, Jake collapsed beside the shelter entrance. His radiation detector had stopped working entirely, its circuits fried by the electromagnetic pulse, but he could tell from the gradual fading of the aurora effects that the immediate danger was over. The shelter had held, and everyone inside was alive. Lady Zephyria was the first person to emerge, pushing through the narrow entrance with desperate urgency. She knelt beside Jake and cradled his head in her lap, her tears falling on his face. As she tried to assess his condition, his skin was burned from radiation exposure, and his breathing was shallow and irregular. "You magnificent fool," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Why did you do this for us? We treated you like garbage, and you saved our lives anyway." Jake managed a weak smile, despite the pain coursing through his body. "Had to prove humans are worth something," he said, his words slurred but understandable. "Maybe now you'll think twice before calling us primitives." Danny Walsh emerged from the shelter next, followed by the Catherians, who had shared the cramped space for the duration of the storm. They formed a circle around Jake, their expressions mixing gratitude with guilt as they realized what his sacrifice had cost him. Many of them had never seen a human up close before, and certainly had never imagined that one would risk his life to save theirs. The sound of approaching aircraft filled the air as human rescue ships finally arrived from the outer system. Commander Lisa Park's voice crackled through Jake's damaged communication device, her relief evident despite the poor connection. "Jake, respond if you can," Lisa called. "We've got medical teams inbound. Your position has been marked, and we're coming to get you." "Still here," Jake managed to say. "Shelter worked. Everyone's alive." "You crazy bastard," Lisa replied, and Jake could hear her crying through the static. "Hang on. We've got the best radiation treatment facilities in the sector. You're going to make it." The medical team that arrived 20 minutes later was equipped with technology that seemed like magic even to the advanced Cytherians. They stabilized Jake's condition with treatments that repaired cellular damage at the molecular level, then transferred him to a hospital ship where human doctors worked around the clock to save his life. Lady Zephyria refused to leave his side during the 3 days he spent in critical condition. She learned about his military service from Commander Lisa Park, discovering that the primitive cargo pilot she had dismissed was actually a decorated war hero who had saved thousands of lives during the conflict with the hegemony. His cargo runs weren't just commercial ventures, but humanitarian missions, carrying medical supplies and emergency equipment to colonies that desperately needed help. When Jake finally regained consciousness, he found Lady Zephyria sitting beside his hospital bed. She had traded her elegant robes for simple human clothing, and her hair was pulled back in a practical style that made her look younger and more approachable. In her hands, she held his worn leather cargo bag, the one she had seen him drop when he saved the Cytherian child. "I had someone examine this while you were unconscious," she said quietly. "Do you know what's inside?" Jake nodded weakly. "Medical supplies for New Haven Colony. Antibiotics, surgical equipment, synthetic blood. People are dying there from a plague outbreak." Lady Zephyria opened the bag and carefully removed one of the antibiotic vials, holding it up to the light. "This single vial could save dozens of lives. The entire contents of your bag are worth more than my crystal handbag ever was, because they have the power to preserve life itself." She set the vial down gently and met Jake's eyes. "I said your bag was worthless, but I was wrong. Everything I value is just decoration, while everything you carry has real meaning. I've spent my whole life collecting beautiful objects, but you collect opportunities to help others." Jake tried to sit up, but found he was still too weak. "Your bag was beautiful too, and expensive. I really am sorry I broke it." "I had it repaired," Lady Zephyria said with a smile. "It turns out Cytherian crystal growing technology is more resilient than I thought, but I've decided not to carry it anymore. Instead, I want to carry something like this." She held up a simple canvas bag similar to the one Jake used for his cargo runs. "I've been talking to Commander Park about joining your humanitarian missions. It seems humans could use someone with my resources and connections to help coordinate relief efforts across the galaxy." Jake stared at her in amazement. "You want to become a cargo pilot?" "I want to become useful," Lady Zephyria replied. "You showed me that real worth isn't measured in credits or status, but in what you're willing to sacrifice for others. I've spent my entire life being decorative, and I think it's time I learned to be functional instead." The medical supplies in Jake's bag eventually reached New Haven Colony, where they helped stop the plague outbreak and saved hundreds of lives. But the story of what happened in the plaza on Velthera Prime spread much further than one small colony. Lady Zephyria used her influence to share Jake's story across the galaxy, helping to change how advanced civilizations viewed humanity and proving that sometimes the most valuable things come in the plainest packages. The makeshift shelter was barely finished when the sky above Velthera Prime began to burn. Jake looked up through the crystal spires and saw streams of green and gold light dancing across the heavens like aurora, beautiful and deadly. His radiation detector was screaming now, the readings climbing so high that the device's upper limit couldn't display them accurately. Everyone inside now. Jake shouted over the growing electromagnetic interference that made the air itself seem to hum with dangerous energy. Stay low and keep away from the walls. The crowd of humans and Cytherians rushed toward the shelter entrance, a narrow opening Jake had created between two shopping cart frames. Lady Zephyria helped guide the frightened aliens inside, her voice calm and reassuring despite the terror Jake could see in her large eyes. She had learned quickly during the construction process, and now she moved with the efficiency of someone who understood that every second counted. Jake counted heads as people squeezed through the entrance. 47, 48, 49. The shelter was getting crowded, but there was still room for more. Danny Walsh was helping an elderly Cytherian couple navigate the narrow space, while other humans worked to calm the panicking aliens who had never experienced anything like this before. 60-3, 64, 65. Jake's heart began to sink as he realized the scope of the problem. When he had designed the shelter, he had estimated the crowd at around 50 people. But more aliens kept appearing from side streets and neighboring buildings, drawn by the high knowledge that someone was offering protection from the approaching death. 78, 79, 80. The shelter was now packed beyond its safe capacity, but people kept coming. Jake saw a group of human tourists running across the plaza, followed by a family of Cytherians carrying young children. Behind them came more shoppers and vendors, all desperate to find safety before the radiation wave hit in full force. How many can it hold? Lady Zephyria asked, appearing at Jake's side. Her expensive robes were torn and dirty, and there was a cut on her forehead from where she had bumped into a low-hanging crystal formation. But she looked more alive than Jake had ever seen her, energized by the crisis in a way that made him understand why she was considered a leader among her people. Jake did quick calculations in his head, factoring in the shelter's internal volume, the thickness of the radiation shielding, and the life support capacity of the repurposed cooling units. The numbers were not encouraging. Maybe 60 people safely, he said. 80 if we're lucky and everyone stays calm. But there are at least 150 people in the plaza, and more arriving every minute. Lady Zephyria looked around at the growing crowd, and Jake saw her face go pale. What happens to the ones who don't fit? They die, Jake said simply. There was no point in sugarcoating the truth. The radiation levels are going to be lethal for anyone caught outside. Even a few minutes of exposure will cause fatal cellular damage. More people pushed toward the shelter entrance, their voices rising in panic as they realized that not everyone would fit inside. A few fights broke out as aliens tried to force their way ahead of others, and Jake saw that the situation was rapidly deteriorating into chaos. We need to maintain order, Lady Zephyria said, raising her voice to address the crowd. Everyone will be saved, but we must be organized about it. But Jake knew she was lying, and from the look in her eyes, she knew it too. There simply wasn't enough room for everyone, and no time to build additional shelters. Someone was going to have to make an impossible choice about who lived and who died. Commander, Lisa Park's voice crackled through Jake's communication device, barely audible through the growing electromagnetic interference. Lisa commanded the Human Rescue Coordination Center for this sector, and she had served with Jake during some of the worst battles of the Hegemony War. Jake, are you there? Lisa's voice was tense with urgency. We're tracking the flare's progress, and you've got maybe 30 seconds before the main wave hits. Whatever you're doing, you need to be finished now. We've got a problem, Lisa, Jake replied, speaking quietly so the crowd wouldn't overhear. Too many people, not enough shelter. I don't think we can save everyone. How many are we talking? About? Jake looked around the plaza again, counting the desperate faces turned toward their makeshift refuge. Maybe 200 total. The shelter can handle 60 safely, maybe 80 if we push it. There was a long silence on the other end of the communication link. Lisa had been in situations like this before, during the war, when impossible choices had to be made with no good options available. She understood the mathematics of survival better than most people. Jake, you know what you have to do, Lisa said finally. Save who you can. That's all anyone can ask. But Jake wasn't ready to accept that answer. He looked at the shelter he had built, studying its construction with the eye of an engineer who had spent years learning to make the impossible work. The metallic fabrics and crystal blocks would provide excellent radiation shielding, but only if the structure remained intact during the storm. The problem was that the electromagnetic pulse from the solar flare would create massive electrical currents in any metallic material it encountered. Those currents would generate heat and could potentially cause the shelter's framework to fail at critical joints. Someone would need to monitor the structure from outside, making adjustments and repairs as needed to keep it stable. Someone who would be exposed to lethal radiation levels while everyone else stayed safe inside. I need to stay outside, Jake announced, his voice carrying across the plaza despite the growing atmospheric disturbance. The shelter needs constant monitoring during the storm. If the framework fails, everyone inside dies. Lady Zephyria grabbed his arm with surprising strength. That's suicide. You said yourself that the radiation will be lethal. It will be, Jake agreed. But if I don't monitor the systems, the shelter could collapse and kill everyone inside. This way, at least most of you survive. Danny Walsh pushed through the crowd toward them, his young face pale with understanding. I'll stay with you, he said. 2 people can monitor the shelter better than one. No, Jake said firmly. You've got a family back on Earth. Get in the shelter and stay. Alive, that's an order. You're not my commanding officer anymore, Danny replied with a shaky smile. And I'm not leaving you out here alone. The sky above them suddenly exploded with light as the solar flare's main waves struck Velthera Prime's upper atmosphere. The aurora effects became so bright that they cast shadows on the ground, and Jake could feel the electromagnetic energy making his skin tingle with dangerous potential. Everyone inside now, Jake shouted, pushing people toward the shelter entrance. Danny, get in there and help keep everyone calm. Lady Zephyria was the last person standing outside the shelter, her eyes locked on Jake's face with an expression he couldn't quite read. Why are you doing this? She asked. After the way I treated you, after the things I said about humans, why would you sacrifice your life to save mine? Jake thought about her question for a moment, listening to the growing roar of electromagnetic energy in the atmosphere above them. The radiation detector in his hand was making sounds he had never heard before, electronic squeals that indicated readings far beyond its design parameters. Because it's the right thing to do, he said finally. And because someone needs to prove that humans are worth more than you think we are. Lady Zephyria stared at him for another second, then leaned forward and kissed his cheek before diving through the shelter entrance. Jake sealed the opening behind her and turned to face the burning sky alone, his hands already reaching for the tools he would need to keep the shelter stable during the coming storm. Jake watched the panic spread through the plaza like wildfire. Cytherians who had been elegant and composed moments before now stumbled over each other in their desperate rush to find shelter. Their flowing robes tangled around their legs as they ran, and their musical voices became harsh with terror. The beautiful crystal spires that defined their architecture suddenly looked fragile and useless. Against the invisible death approaching from space. Lady Zephyria grabbed Jake's shoulder. Again, her grip tight enough to leave bruises. "Where are the shelters?" she demanded. "Every civilized world has emergency shelters for situations like this. Tell me where they are." Jake checked his radiation detector and felt his stomach clench. The readings were climbing so fast that the device could barely keep up. They had maybe 4 minutes before the main radiation wave hit, and he could see that the Cytherians had no idea how to protect themselves from something their technology couldn't simply deflect. "Your emergency shelters are designed for meteor impacts and atmospheric storms," Jake explained, speaking quickly as he scanned the plaza for anything useful. "They won't stop gamma radiation. The walls are too thin, and the doors aren't sealed properly. Anyone who goes into those shelters is going to die just as fast as people who stay out here." The words hit Lady Zephyria like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her large eyes wide with disbelief. "That's impossible. Our engineers are the finest in the galaxy. They would never build inadequate shelters." "Your engineers are smart," Jake agreed, "but they've never had to deal with something like this before. Your shields have protected this planet for so long that nobody remembers how to survive without them." Jake started moving toward the luxury shops that lined the plaza, his mind racing through everything he remembered from his military training. During the war against the hegemony, human forces had often been caught in radiation zones without proper shelter. They had learned to build protection from whatever materials they could find, using principles that were as old as civilization itself. The first shop Jake entered sold clothing made from rare materials gathered across the galaxy. The Cytherian sales clerk was cowering behind the counter, too frightened to protest as Jake began pulling metallic fabrics from their display racks. The materials felt strange under his hands, some as light as silk, but with the density of lead, others that seemed to bend light around themselves. "What are you doing?" Lady Zephyria demanded, following him into the shop. "You can't just steal merchandise. Those fabrics cost more than most people earn in a lifetime." "Right now, they're worth exactly nothing if we're all dead," Jake replied, stuffing the metallic cloth into a shopping cart he had grabbed from the entrance. "Help me gather anything that's dense and metallic. We need to build a radiation shelter, and we need to do it fast." Lady Zephyria stared at him as if he had lost his mind. "Build a shelter? With shopping materials? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. You're just a cargo pilot. What could you possibly know about construction or radiation protection?" Jake ignored her questions and moved to the next shop. This one sold decorative crystals and mineral sculptures, many of them containing heavy elements that would help block radiation. He began loading his cart with anything that looked dense enough to be useful, not caring about the price tags that showed numbers with more zeros than he could count. "I was a combat engineer before I became a pilot," Jake said as he worked. "My unit specialized in building temporary shelters in hostile environments. We learned to use whatever materials were available because we couldn't always count on having proper equipment." More Cytherians began following Jake as word spread that the human might know how to survive. They watched in amazement as he broke into shop after shop, gathering materials that seemed to have nothing in common. Metallic fabrics, dense crystals, cooling units, even shopping carts and display stands all went into his growing collection. Danny Walsh appeared at Jake's shoulder as he emerged from a jewelry store carrying an armload of heavy metal decorations. Danny was another human who had been caught in the plaza, a tourist who had been admiring the Cytherian architecture when the sirens started. He was younger than Jake, maybe 25, with the soft hands of someone who had never done manual labor. "Is it true what they're saying?" Danny asked, his voice tight with fear. "Can you really build something to protect us?" "Maybe," Jake replied honestly. "I can't promise it'll work, but it's better than doing nothing." Can you help me move this stuff to the center of the plaza? We need to work in the open where we have room to build. Danny nodded eagerly and began pushing one of the loaded shopping carts. Other humans emerged from the crowd to help, along with a few Cytherians who had overcome their shock enough to think clearly. Most of the aliens still stood frozen, unable to comprehend that their fate now depended on a species they had always considered primitive. Jake chose a spot near the plaza's central fountain, where the ground was level and there was plenty of space to work. He began laying out the metallic fabrics in overlapping layers, creating a foundation that would serve as the floor of their shelter. The materials were incredibly advanced, designed to be both beautiful and functional, and Jake found that they bonded together when pressed firmly against each other. "What's the theory behind this?" Lady Zephyria asked. She had been watching Jake work with growing fascination, her fear temporarily overcome by scientific curiosity. How can random shopping materials provide better protection than purpose-built shelters? Jake looked up from his work, sweat dripping from his forehead despite the cool air. Radiation protection is all about mass and density. The more material you put between yourself and the source, the safer you are. Your emergency shelters are built light and efficient, with just enough shielding to handle normal threats. But this flare is going to produce radiation levels that are anything but normal. He gestured to the pile of crystal sculptures Danny was arranging. These crystals contain heavy elements like lead and uranium compounds. They're incredibly dense, which means they'll absorb radiation that would pass right through lighter materials. And these metallic fabrics aren't just decorative. They're woven with actual metal threads that will help deflect charged particles. Lady? Zephyria knelt beside him and began helping to arrange the fabric layers. Her movements were clumsy at first, clearly unused to manual labor, but she learned quickly. "I never thought about the practical applications of luxury materials," she admitted. "On Kithra, we value beauty above utility. Function follows form, not the other way around. That's the difference between our species," Jake said, not unkindly. "Humans have always had to make do with less, so we learn to see potential in everything. Your people have had advanced technology for so long that you've forgotten how to improvise." More people joined the construction effort as Jake's plan became clear. He directed them to create walls using shopping cart frames lined with metallic fabrics and dense crystal blocks. The cooling units from various shops were repurposed as air circulation systems, their heavy metal housings providing additional radiation shielding. The work was backbreaking and frantic. Jake's radiation detector showed that they had less than 2 minutes before the main wave hit, and the shelter was only half finished. But something remarkable was happening. Cytherians who had never worked with their hands were learning to follow human instructions, while humans who had felt out of place in this luxury environment were finally in their element. Lady Zephyria worked beside Jake, her expensive robes now dirty and torn from handling rough materials. Her perfectly styled hair hung in tangles around her face, and her hands were cut from sharp crystal edges. But there was something in her expression that hadn't been there before, a kind of fierce determination that reminded Jake of his fellow soldiers during the worst battles of the war. "Will this actually work?" she asked as they fitted the last wall panel into place. Jake checked his detector one more time and felt his heart race. The radiation levels were spiking toward lethal ranges, and he could see the first flickering lights in the sky that meant the flare's electromagnetic pulse was beginning to interact with the planet's atmosphere. "I guess we're about to find out," he said. The security guards were only 20 meters away when Jake's communication device began beeping with an urgent message. He ignored it at first, focused on gathering the last of Lady Zephyria's scattered treasures. But the beeping grew more insistent. The small device clipped to his belt was military grade, designed to cut through any interference when his old unit needed to reach him. "Lady," Zephyria continued her tirade as Jake worked. She described in vivid detail how she would have him thrown into prison, how his cargo license would be revoked, and how she would make sure no respectable company would ever hire him again. The crowd around them murmured their approval, clearly enjoying the spectacle of a human being put in his proper place. "That necklace alone is worth more than your ship," Lady Zephyria declared, pointing at a delicate chain Jake had just picked up. It was crafted by master artisans on Crystar 7 using techniques that take decades to learn. Your primitive brain cannot even comprehend its true value. Jake held out the necklace to her, careful not to let his fingers touch the glowing blue stone at its center. "Here, take it back. I really am sorry about your bag. Maybe someone can fix it?" Lady Zephyria snatched the necklace from his hand as if his touch might contaminate it. "Fix it? You ignorant savage, that bag was grown, not made. It took 50 years to cultivate the crystal matrix, and another 20 to program the bioluminescent patterns. It cannot simply be fixed like some crude human tool." The communication device beeped again, louder this time. Jake recognized the emergency pattern and felt his stomach drop. Only 2 people had access to that frequency, and both of them knew better than to interrupt him unless something terrible was happening. "Answer your little toy," Lady Zephyria said with contempt. "Let the whole plaza hear what sort of crude business a creature like you conducts." Jake activated the device reluctantly. Captain Rex Stone's voice crackled through the speaker, tense with urgency. Rex had served with Jake in the human military for 6 years, and they had stayed friends even after Jake left to become a cargo pilot. Rex now commanded a patrol ship that monitored the outer system for threats. "Jake, where are you right now?" Rex asked without preamble. "Velthera Prime, in the main shopping district," Jake replied, acutely aware of the hundreds of alien eyes watching him. "Why? What's wrong?" "You need to get to shelter immediately," Rex said. "We're tracking a massive solar flare that's going to hit the planet in about 8 minutes. The radiation levels are going to be lethal for anyone caught in the open." "Lady?" Zephyria laughed, a sound like crystal bells ringing. "Solar flares? Our planetary shields can handle anything your primitive sun can produce. We have technology that your species won't develop for another 1,000 years. Jake ignored her and focused on Rex's voice. "How massive are we talking about? Class 5? Class 6? Try Class 9? Rex replied grimly. "This thing is off the charts, Jake. It's the biggest flare we've recorded in this system. The Cytherian shields might deflect normal solar radiation, but this is going to punch right through them like they're made of paper." The crowd began to murmur uneasily. Even though they couldn't understand the technical details of Jake's conversation, the fear in his voice was universal. Lady Zephyria's expression shifted from contempt to confusion as she watched Jake's face grow pale. "What about evacuation?" Jake asked. "Can you get transport ships down here?" "Negative," Rex said. "Every ship in the system is already running for deep space. The electromagnetic pulse from this flare is going to fry any electronics caught in the radiation zone. Even our shielded military vessels can't risk getting close to the planet until this thing passes." Jake felt the blood drain from his face as the implications hit him. A Class 9 solar flare would kill every living thing on the surface of Velthera. Prime within minutes of contact. The radiation would be so intense that even underground shelters might not provide adequate protection. And if the ships were evacuating, that meant everyone in the shopping district was trapped. "How long do we have?" Jake asked. 7 minutes, maybe less, Rex replied. "Jake, find the deepest, most heavily shielded building you can and get inside. Use anything metallic you can find to create additional barriers. And Jake? I'm sorry, buddy. I wish we could do more." The communication cut off, leaving Jake standing in the center of the plaza with hundreds of wealthy aliens staring at him in growing alarm. Lady Zephyria stepped closer, her earlier anger replaced by something that might have been fear. "What did your friend mean about our shields failing?" she asked, her musical voice now carrying a tremor. "Our technology is far superior to anything humans possess. Surely you misunderstood." Jake looked around the plaza, taking in the crystal spires, the floating platforms, and the delicate architecture that defined Catherian civilization. Everything was beautiful, elegant, and completely unsuited for protection against lethal radiation. The buildings were designed to let in light and air, not to keep out electromagnetic death. "Your shields are designed to deflect normal solar radiation," Jake explained, speaking loudly enough for the entire crowd to hear. "They work by creating an electromagnetic barrier that pushes charged particles away from the planet. But a Class 9 flare produces so much energy that it overloads the system. It's like trying to stop a tsunami with a screen door." The first sign of trouble came from above. The floating platforms that carried shoppers between levels began to wobble and spark as their anti-gravity systems struggled against increasing electromagnetic interference. One platform tilted dangerously before its emergency systems kicked in and lowered it to the ground with a jarring impact. "Lady," Zephyria grabbed Jake's arm with surprising strength. "You're lying," she said desperately. "You're just trying to frighten us because of what happened with my bag. Humans are known for their cruel sense of humor." Jake pulled free from her grip and ran to where he had dropped his cargo bag. The medical supplies inside were precious, but right now he needed the emergency kit that every military-trained pilot carried. His hands shook as he opened the bag and pulled out a small radiation detector, a device he had hoped never to use. Again, the detector came to life with a high-pitched whine that grew louder every second. The digital display showed radiation levels that were already climbing toward dangerous levels, and they were accelerating. Jake had seen readings like this only once before, during the solar storm that had destroyed the mining colony on Kepler 442b. 6 minutes, he announced to the crowd. Maybe less. The radiation is already starting to build up in the upper atmosphere. That was when the emergency sirens began to wail. The sound started low and mournful, then rose to a shriek that seemed to come from every direction at once. It was the planetary warning system, designed to alert the population to catastrophic threats. Jake had heard that sound during military exercises, but never in a real emergency. The effect on the crowd was immediate and terrifying. Hundreds of elegant Catherians who had been calmly shopping moments before suddenly began screaming and running in every direction. Their graceful movements became clumsy and panicked as they fled toward buildings that might offer protection. "Lady." Zephyria stood frozen in the center of the chaos, her crystal handbag forgotten at her feet. The beautiful alien who had commanded such respect and authority now looked lost and vulnerable, like a child who had suddenly realized that her parents couldn't protect her from everything. Jake looked at his radiation detector again and felt his heart sink. The levels were climbing faster than his worst-case projections. They had maybe 5 minutes before the main wave hit, and he was standing in the middle of an open plaza with no protection except his knowledge of how radiation worked and his determination to survive. Jake Martinez wiped the sweat from his forehead as he hurried through the crowded marketplace of Velthera Prime. His cargo ship had been delayed for 3 hours due to a mechanical failure, and now he was running late for the most important delivery of his career. The medical supplies in his worn leather bag could save hundreds of lives on the remote colony of New Haven, but only if he could get them to the transport hub before the next scheduled jump. The shopping district on Velthera Prime was unlike anything Jake had ever seen during his 5 years as a cargo pilot. Towering crystal spires stretched into the purple sky, their surfaces gleaming with holographic advertisements for luxury goods that cost more than most humans made in a lifetime. Floating platforms carried wealthy alien shoppers between levels, while street vendors sold exotic foods that smelled of spices Jake couldn't identify. The air itself seemed to shimmer with wealth and privilege. Jake felt completely out of place in his simple blue jumpsuit and worn boots. The other humans he passed were either well-dressed tourists or servants accompanying their alien employers. None of them looked like they had ever worked with their hands or worried about making a delivery on time. He clutched his bag tighter and pushed through the crowd, trying to ignore the stares from the elegant alien shoppers who moved aside as if he might contaminate them. The Cytherians who dominated this world were tall and graceful, with pale blue skin that seemed to glow from within. Their large eyes held an intelligence that made Jake feel primitive by comparison, and their movements were so fluid they appeared to dance rather than walk. Most wore flowing robes made from materials that shifted color in the light, and their voices carried musical tones that made human speech sound harsh and crude. Lady Zephyria Valanash was the most beautiful Cytherian Jake had ever seen. She stood near the entrance to an exclusive jewelry store, surrounded by a small crowd of admirers who hung on her every word. Her bio-silk robes were the color of sunset over water, and they moved around her like liquid light. In her slender hands, she held a handbag that seemed to be carved from a single piece of living crystal, its surface pulsing with soft rainbow colors. Jake had heard about Lady Zephyria from other pilots who frequented the spaceports. She was the daughter of a powerful trade consortium leader and one of the wealthiest individuals in this sector of the galaxy. Her parties were legendary, her fashion choices were copied across dozens of worlds, and her opinions could make or break entire industries. She was also known for her complete disdain for humans, whom she considered barely civilized savages who had somehow stumbled into space travel. As Jake hurried past the jewelry store, he couldn't help but overhear Lady Zephyria's conversation with her admirers. She was describing her latest acquisition, a rare gemstone from the Andromeda Galaxy that had cost her more than most star systems generated in a year. Her voice carried that musical quality common to all Cytherians, but there was a coldness beneath the beauty that made Jake's skin crawl. The primitive species simply cannot appreciate true artistry, Lady Zephyria was saying to her audience. They see only function where we see form, only utility where we see beauty. It is why they will always remain servants while we lead the galaxy toward enlightenment. Jake tried to ignore her words and focus on his mission. The medical supplies in his bag included antibiotics that could stop a plague outbreak, surgical instruments needed for emergency operations, and synthetic blood that could save lives in the next few hours. Every minute he wasted here meant people might die on New Haven, and that thought drove him forward faster than pride or anger ever could. The crowd around Lady Zephyria suddenly shifted as a group of young Cytherian nobles approached to pay their respects. Jake found himself caught in the flow of moving bodies, pushed closer to the jewelry store entrance than he wanted to be. He tried to step aside, but a floating cargo platform descended from above, blocking his path and forcing him to squeeze between two groups of shoppers. That was when disaster struck. A small Cytherian child, no more than the equivalent of 8 human years, darted between the adults chasing a toy that had escaped his grasp. The toy was a miniature starship that flew in erratic patterns, and the child was completely focused on catching it. Jake saw the collision coming a split second before it happened, but there was nowhere for him to go in the crowded space. The child slammed into Jake's legs at full speed, bouncing off and falling backward toward the hard crystal pavement. Without thinking, Jake dropped his bag and caught the child, spinning to absorb the impact and protect the small body from harm. The motion sent him stumbling sideways, directly into Lady Zephyria's path. The collision was spectacular. Jake's shoulder struck Lady Zephyria's arm, just as she was gesturing with her precious crystal handbag. sending the priceless accessory flying through the air in a graceful arc. The bag struck the pavement with a sound like breaking bells, and its contents scattered across the plaza in a rainbow explosion of gems, jewelry, and precious metals. Lady Zephyria stared at the disaster for a long moment, her large eyes growing wider with each passing second. The crowd around her fell silent, as if someone had turned off the sound in the universe. Even the child in Jake's arms stopped crying and looked up at the human who had saved him from a nasty fall. And Lady Zephyria began to scream, "This bag is worth more than you." She shrieked, her musical voice transformed into something harsh and terrible. "Do you have any idea what you have done, you clumsy primitive? That bag cost more than your entire species has contributed to galactic civilization." Jake set the child down gently and immediately dropped to his knees, trying to gather the scattered treasures before they could be trampled or stolen. His hands moved quickly, scooping up gems the size of his thumb and pieces of jewelry that seemed to be made from crystallized starlight. Each item he touched felt warm and alive, as if it contained some form of energy he couldn't understand. "I'm sorry," Jake said, looking up at Lady Zephyr's furious face. "I was just trying to keep the kid from getting hurt. Let me help you get everything back." "Don't touch those with your filthy hands," Lady Zephyria commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been disobeyed. "Guards, arrest this human immediately. He has destroyed priceless artifacts and assaulted a member of noble society." Security officers began moving through the crowd toward Jake, their hands resting on weapons that could stun a full-grown human from 50 meters away. Jake continued gathering the scattered treasures, knowing that running would only make things worse. His cargo bag lay forgotten a few meters away, its contents just as precious as anything Lady Zephyria owned. But far less decorative. The crowd pressed closer, eager to see what would happen to the human who had dared to inconvenience one of their most powerful citizens. Some of them were taking recordings with their personal devices, undoubtedly planning to share the story of the clumsy human who had destroyed Lady Zephyria's famous crystal bag. Jake looked up from the gems in his hands and met Lady Zephyria's angry gaze. In that moment, he realized that nothing he could say or do would change her opinion of him. To her, he would always be just another primitive human, barely worthy of notice, except when he caused problems for his betters. What none of them knew was that in less than 10 minutes, their entire world would change, and the primitive human kneeling on the crystal pavement would become their only hope for survival.